Hello everyone, and thanks for joining me again. In this series of videos, we're going to look at building a Markdown blog with React. And we're not going to use a platform like, say, Gatsby to do it. We're going to do things a little more from scratch, although it would be a little bit disingenuous to say that we were going to build the entire blog from scratch, because using React means necessarily that you're not starting with, say, vanilla JavaScript. But we're going to not rely on something like the Gatsby data layer to help us build a blog. Now, if you've built a Markdown blog in Gatsby before, and you can follow their tutorial at their docs site, you find that it's not too difficult. They have a way of basically converting your Markdown files to HTML and also to turning them into data so that you could store them and access them later as, like, say, each blog post would be a data node rather than having to use a database. And that's one of the beautiful things about being able to use something like Gatsby to make a blog. And we're going to do something similar, but we're going to write our own logic for turning our Markdown files into data. And it's not going to be too difficult. So without talking too much more about it, let's just get into it. So we'll go ahead and we'll use create React app to get started. And I'm just going to call my project Markdown blog. You can call yours whatever you like. All right, we're almost done loading in our React application. Make sure that we have that file in our workspace. There it is. Okay. So now we have that blog added to our workspace, or that project added to our workspace. We can go ahead and cd into it. And then, as per usual with create React app, you can just do npm start. And we should see our basic create React app project template at localhost 3000, and we do. Okay, good. So for now, go ahead and stop your project. What we're going to need now is first some content for our blog. Now, usually you would use, like, if you were using something like WordPress, they have an easy way on their admin page to add blog content. But for us, we're going to add our content as Markdown files. So in your source folder, create a new folder, and we're just going to call this content. All right, and in there we'll create some Markdown files. All right, we'll call our first posts first post, and it's a Markdown file. So now, if you're familiar with making Markdown posts, Markdown blog posts, or blog posts in Markdown, and say you've used something like Jekyll, then you've added front matter to your blog post, or to your file. And what this does is it gives you your blog post metadata. For example, the title, and we're just going to call this good, and we'll give it an author. Why not? And how about a date published? And we'll just say December. What is today? Today is the 11th. In Tokyo right now, it's the 11th. All right, good. And then when you close off, or you want to end entering in your metadata, you just put in the 3 hyphens to close off your front matter, and then you can add your content below that. For example, if you've used Markdown before, you know that just by putting a hash mark followed by some text, that'll give you something like an H1 tag in HTML, and it'll be bolded. So can italicize text by using 2 asterisks and putting your text between it. And for example. Alright, and let's make another blog post just so we have 2 data nodes to work with. Add that also to our content folder, and we'll just call it second post. And we can imagine that we have, say, 2 different blog authors working on this blog site. Alright, so change the front matter a little bit. Actually, since this is another author, why don't we just say okay, I should not have put in those double quotes there. Alright, and we'll say this author would be what? Susan Thomas. I don't know. Why not? I don't know anyone with that name, but seems general enough. So we have 2 blog posts. All right, now these Markdown files, you could just use a Markdown parser, and we are going to use one at some point. And then you could create yourself a component and then add that component to, say, a page in your blog. Like, for example, we can go ahead and create a home page. Let's just create a file called pages. Right, and in there we can put in a new file, and we'll actually, let's not do that right now. We're going to get to this later. Go ahead and delete that. Right. Basically, you can see that we'll want to bring in these Markdown files, each one as its own individual blog post, and save them as sort of like data object, like you would in a database, right? Where it would have the fields, you know, blog title, blog author, and blog date, and then it would, of course, it would have the content. And if you were using a database, of course, you know, you would have this in a field called content, and it would be a big long string. But what we're going to do is we're going to create our own way of saving these posts as data. So first, what I'd like you to do is go into your public folder and create a file called getPosts. It's a JavaScript file, right? And we're going to use a couple of native functions in Node. The first one will be path. And you've probably used this before if you've, say, set up an Express server in Node. We'll use another one called fs. We'll use this to actually read files. Okay, so let's think about where we are in the project now. This file is in the public folder, and we want to actually go grab our blog content from the content folder. So let's create a path. For that, we're going to call it dir path, directory path. And then double underscore dir name. And then we're going to back out of the public folder, so // and then we're going to go into the source folder and into the content folder. Okay, so that'll be our path to the content directory. And then what we're going to want to do is eventually create these post objects. There's just going to be JavaScript objects that have the fields that we want them to have. For example, the properties of title, author, date, and then of course content, and that will be the actual blog body. All right, but for now, and then once we do create those, we're going to want to save those to an array so we can loop over that array and then dynamically display our blog posts. But for now, just go ahead and create a variable called postList and let it be an empty array for now. Good. All right, so now we'll create our function that gets the posts. So let's make a function. We'll call it getPosts. And this is going to be an asynchronous function. All right. And the first thing we want to do is we want to take a look at the directory that has our blog posts, which would be the content directory. Okay. So we'll use, well, of course this is asynchronous, so we'll use await first, and then we'll say fs. So we're going to start using fs now, and we're going to use a native function called read directory. And first we're going to pass in the path to the directory, which would be dirpath. And then we're going to pass in a callback, say error and files. And that'll be the files that are in the directory. And then give ourselves a little error handling here. If error, what do we want to do? We'll say return. We'll just log it to the console. Failed to list contents of directory. And the error. Okay, but assuming there are no errors, then for each file we'll want to open the file and do stuff in there. So first, let's open the files. We'll use the for each function. We'll say files, because this is going to be an array of files. For each. And then we're going to say for each file, and we'll use the index probably. And we're going to define an object now called just obj, and it'll be an empty object, and we're going to use this later. All right, this will probably be, actually, don't worry about it now. We're going to use this to build our blog post object. And then, of course, we'll need that blog post variable as well. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to read the file. So we use fs.read file. All right, and then here, what we need is the path to the file. So remember, we stored our path to the directory as a variable, so we'll bring that in. dirpath / and then pass in file as a variable. Okay, so at this point I'm just going to assume we're not going to get any errors. All right, but what do these contents look like? All right, we can actually go ahead and display them. First, before we do that, let's take a look at what's in our directory. Here we've actually opened our directory and looked at it to see the files, let's go ahead and take a look at the files. So we'll log those to the console, just to make sure that it's actually reading the directory as it should. Now we need a script to run this code. All right, and also since we're just defining the function here, we haven't actually invoked it. Let's do that now. So go into your package JSON file, and under all your other scripts, create a new script, and we're just going to call this, just call it server. It's not really a server, well, it's kind of like a server. But anyway, we'll say node and then get posts.js, because that's what we called that file. But remember, it was in the public folder, so we've got to do that too. We've got to add that. Okay, good. So now if we run our server, what do we get? Okay, so we see the two files listed in array form. Okay, so that's good. So we're actually seeing those files in the directory, and now we know we can access them. And then for each file, remember, we're opening the file, right? So let's say console.log the contents of the file. And we don't need this anymore. And so one more time, run your server. Okay, good. So we can see the first blog post we had here. We've got the front matter, the metadata, and then we've got the body, which is here. And then for the second file, which is our second blog post, we have the metadata and then the body. Good. So we're reading the files as we should. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to parse these files so that we can separate out the metadata from the actual body. All right, so we're going to need a function, and what that function is going to do is it's going to go into a post, and it's going to read it line by line, and it's going to say if there are these 3 bars, then everything after that and then the next set of 3 bars is going to be your metadata. So we're going to take those lines and turn it into our metadata. All right, so the first thing that we'll want to do is create a variable called lines, and we want to take the contents, which are now in string form, and let's check that. Okay, run your server again. Good, so those are strings. We want to turn those strings into arrays of different strings as the elements, which are lines of the blog post. Very good, so again, we're going to call that lines. This will be an array. So take the contents, use the split function to turn it into an array, and we're going to split it by line breaks. Okay, let's take a look at that. Run your server. Okay, so you can see that the first blog post is now an array of lines, or an array of strings where each string represents a line, separated by line breaks. Okay, so that's working. And then what we'd like to do is we would like to get the indices of those lines with the dashes. Right? So we know that, say for this post right here, it would be the 0 index or the 0th index and then the 4th index, right? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so we'll create a function that does that, and we'll save it. We'll save what it returns to a value called metadata indices. So we'll say metadata indices. And it should just have 2 values in this array. And then we're going to use the array.reduce function. Okay, and if you're not familiar with the array.reduce function in JavaScript, you can just go to mdn docs, and check it out. Basically, we're going to pass in to our reduce method a reducer function and an initial value, which is going to be an empty array. All right, so that reducer function that we're going to pass in, we're just going to call it get metadata indices. All right, that'll be the name of the function. And then we'll pass in, like I said, an empty array as our initial value. But now we need to define that function get metadata indices. So let's do that now. So where are we going to put this? Oh, let's just put it right here. And in this function, we're going to pass in the first value, which would be sort of accumulator value. What it does is it remembers what you had initially and then it adds to it. And let's just call it ACC for accumulator. Can't think of anything else to call it right now. And then we'll say the item of the array, or element. You can call it element if you like. And what else? Just keep track of the index here. Alright, so actually, let's do this as a fat arrow function, just to stay consistent. And then what did we say again? ACC, element, index. And then we'll say if, and then we're going to use a regular expression to parse this. Basically want to find that. And we'll use the test method to test to see if it's there or not. And what we'll pass to that method will be the element of the array. And we'll say if we have that line with those 3 dashes, then what we want to do is we want to record that index. So to ACC, which remember we passed in as an array, let's say push the index. Right, so that should be all right. And then of course we'll want to return that array. So let's console log metadata indices and see if we're getting those indices. Alright. Let's remove any other console log statements that we might have just so we don't clog up our terminal. Okay. Okay, so we're getting those two arrays of metadata indices, one for each post, and they're giving us the correct information. We've got 3 dashes to begin the front matter at the 0th index, and then we've got 3 dashes to end the front matter at the 4th index. And that's true of both blog posts. But it won't always be true if you change your front matter from one post to the next. I'm just keeping things consistent here to make things easier to understand. All right, good. So now we know that we have our metadata indices, and now we have to parse those lines to make sure that we can save our metadata separately from the content. All right, so now what we'll want to do is create a function and save it to a variable called parse metadata. Well, the variable will be metadata. And then that will equal our function parse metadata, which we haven't defined yet. And to parse metadata, what are we going to pass? We're going to pass the lines array, right, the lines of the blog posts, and the metadata indices. We'll need those. So now let's define that function, parse metadata, and we can put that right below our other function. And then we're passing in again the lines and the metadata indices. Alright, and then what are we going to do? We're going to say that if we have a metadata indices array with elements in it, then what we want to do is we want to slice the lines array between those two indices that have the 3 dash marks. So if that doesn't make sense, probably you'll recognize it in the code. So we'll say if metadata indices dot length is greater than 0, which means there are some elements in the array, the metadata indices array, then we'll change lines, or we'll make a copy of the lines array, and we'll call it lines, why not? And we'll slice between, well, first, your metadata indices array value at the 0th index is going to be 0, right? So we don't want the lines array. Remember what the lines array is, right? It's all of the lines of the blog post. We don't want that first line at the 0th index, those 3 dashes. We only want what comes after. So we'll say metadata indices okay, right, so remember we're going to slice starting at index 1 of our lines array, right, which will be the line right after the first 3 dash marks. In our post it's actually going to be title. So we're going to start from here, right? We're not going to include this one. So we start from here, and then we're going to finish by including this line, but not including these 3 dashes, and that will be our metadata. So we'll go all the way to metadata indices of 1. Remember, which is actually 4, because it's the value at the first index of the metadata indices array, and we don't want to include that, so that will be our upper bound. Okay, so actually I completely messed this up. This should be let metadata, all right, equal lines dot slice. Okay, good. And then for that array, for the metadata array, and we'll use the for each function again. For each what? For each line. For each line, what are we going to do? We're going to save. We're going to create an object where the properties match the fields in our metadata here, and then the values associated with the properties match the values to the right of the colon here. All right, so it's going to look quite similar to this. So remember we created earlier on this empty object array. Now we're going to add stuff to it. All right, so we'll say here the object with property line.split, right? And we're going to split around those colons, right? Split around here. That's colon space basically that we're going to split around. Right, and that will be the first element, because once you split, it's going to split excuse me, it's going to split this line into two elements, right, around this colon and space. This will be the first element, and this will be the second element. So the first part of our, or the property that we're going to add to our object is going to be title, so we want to add this part. So that's why we're going to put zero here. Good. And that's going to equal, remember, all of this, which will be the second element in the split array. All right, so that should be good. And then we're going to return that object. Remember, we're just creating the metadata here, not the entire blog post. But before we return it, let's make sure that we actually have the metadata. So console.log metadata. No, object, I'm sorry. So go ahead and run your server again. Okay, good. So we've got two objects containing our metadata. Here's the first one, and here is the second one. And again, if it, or not again, but if it doesn't make sense to you what we did with this code here, like I said, for each property in our object that we're creating, so for our first property, we're going to call it title, right? We give it that property by passing in the first element in the two element split array. Right, and then for the value associated with that property, we pass in the second element in that two-value split array. Right, and like I said, if it doesn't make sense, take some time. It will. It's probably something you've done quite a few times before in JavaScript. You just might not really be recalling it now. And so go ahead and get rid of that console log statement. We know we're getting our metadata, and return that object. So we've parsed out our metadata, and that's good. So now we need something to parse out the actual content of the blog post. So we'll say create a function, and we're going to call that function content. Not contents, be careful. Up here we've got contents, but this is not what we're talking about. We're creating a new variable here. All right, and that's going to need a function, and we're going to call that parse content. All right, and that will take in also lines and metadata indices. All right, don't forget to use destructuring assignment here. Okay, so let's go create our function parse content. we're passing into that function lines and metadata indices. Okay. And then we're going to use the same conditional. We're going to say if metadata indices dot length is greater than 0, let lines equal lines dot slice. And now we're going to take a slice of that lines array after this second set of hash marks right here. Right, so we're going to take everything from the 5th index onward. Okay, so that will be metadata indices of 1, which if you recall was actually the value 4. But we don't want to take that one included, so we're going to say +1, right, to start from 5. And then we're going to evaluate all the way to the end of that lines array. So pass in lines.length. Alright, and that should be good. Let's just console log to make sure we're getting the actual content. And what shall we do? We'll say here lines, because remember lines is an array, we want to turn it back into a string, so we'll use the join function and we'll join it by line breaks, or join it around line breaks. Alright, let's see what we get. Okay, good. So we get all those lines back. For the first blog post, we had this as the content. We parsed that out. And for the second blog post, we have this. Remember, we're keeping the markdown because we're actually not going to convert it to HTML until we start working on the actual React pages of our project. We're not going to get there today or in this video. We'll get there in the next video. Very good. So instead of console logging this, what we'll want to do is just return it. All right. Okay, so now what we'll want to do is, remember earlier we created this post variable. Now we want to fill that in, and it's going to be an object. All right. So we'll say that we're going to give it an ID, because later when we add in routing to, because we're going to display our blog posts dynamically using a blog post page template, so we'll want to make sure that the ID is available to do that when we add in React Router, so that we don't have to create a million paths to a million different pages. All right, so call that first field ID, and we'll say that it's index +1. I don't want to use a 0 index for IDs. That's just a personal preference. Give it a title, and this title will be, and we'll get that from the metadata. So we'll say that if there is a title, right? So we'll say if metadata dot title, we're going to use a ternary operator here. Metadata dot title, then we'll return metadata dot title. Otherwise, we'll say no title given. Okay, and then for the author, we'll do the same. So let's just, sorry. All right, so for the author, say metadata.author. If there is one, we'll return it. If not, no author given. And do the same thing finally for the, you know what? I don't really want to worry about the date right now. Well, let's go ahead and do it anyway. Say metadata.date. and there should be a date. Okay, and then finally the content. And then now that is not from metadata, that comes from content, right? So we'll say if there is content, then return it. If not, just keep things uniform, say no content given. All right. Now we have this post object, and we're going to do this for each blog post or for each Markdown file. We want to save these post objects as data points, and we want to push them to an array that we can loop over. So remember earlier we created that array, we called it post list. So now we're actually going to push them to that array. So we'll say here push list dot post, push list. Jeez, I'm dyslexic, I think. Post list dot push, and then push in the post. Add that post to the array. Okay, now once we've looped over all the files, all right, we want to take a look at our post list and see if it's filled in. See if we have an array of JavaScript objects. So we'll say console.log post list. All right, now I don't expect that we're actually going to see an array here, or we're going to see an empty array probably, just because we're not waiting long enough for everything to get done. All right, so if we do npm run server again, all right, you see that we've got this empty array. All right. Eventually they'll get there. It's not that it's not happening, it's just that we can't see it so soon. Right? If we log everything to the console right now, all of this other logic up here isn't finished yet, so we're not seeing that completed post list array with the posts in it. So let's include this in a set timeout function just to see it. All right, and we'll just give it, say, I don't know, 500 milliseconds, a half a second. Should be good. All right, so one more time, run your server. Good, and there it is. So you've got your post list array, right? The array starts here, and the first element is your first blog post, right? You've got your metadata, your title, author, and date. And then, of course, you've got your content here. And in the next video, what we're going to do is we're actually going to write all this into a JSON file as a large JSON object, right? Which basically will be the post list array. And then we'll loop over that and we'll generate our blog post pages dynamically. But for now, we're going to stop here, and I hope that you were able to follow what we've done. And if you haven't, please take some time to just go through it again and make sure that you're up to speed for the next video. And I will see you soon. Thank you very much. Cheers.